Could I have everyone's attention? I hope everyone enjoyed their dinner. Please continue with dessert and enjoy that. I want to give special thanks to Frank Cesario and Chris Carney for inviting Dave Revsine to be tonight's keynote speaker. Chris is going to introduce Dave in a moment. We're very grateful to Tatum and to Chris for their years of support to Chicago FEI. Chris is a managing partner of Tatum's largest region, leading the team that provides clients with senior-level interim project and search services in accounting, finance, and IT. Tatum's central region set new records for financial performance each of the past 6 years, and the first quarter of 2015 was its best ever start to the year.
Wow.
Earlier in his career, Chris audited financial statements of middle market companies at Arthur Andersen and Deloitte. He earned his accounting degree from Purdue University, and he passed the CPA exam in 1990. Chris has previously moderated several FEI panel events, most recently in January of 2015. Tatum is also a co-sponsor of the FEI Chicago CFO of the Year Awards, and Tatum also paid for the 100 books that you will hear more about tonight from Dave. Please welcome Chris to the podium. He's going to introduce Dave for us.
Thank you, Otis, and special thanks to Susan Gidley for planning and executing another top-notch FEI event. January 22nd CFO-CIO panel event had record-high attendance for a panel event, just as tonight has record-high attendance for a speaker series dinner. It's terrific to hear that the great Frank Cesario is going to be the next volunteer FEI president. Let's hear it for Frank. He's got big shoes to fill with Janine McGreal and with Otis, but Frank is an outstanding choice by the FEI. Kudos to Frank for inviting Dave Revsine to be tonight's keynote speaker. We've all heard the saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This applies to the economy in many ways, where the key global and domestic drivers are still metrics like consumer spending, labor participation rate, currency fluctuation, and interest rates. The slogan also applies to accounting, finance, and business in general, where the trends and challenges include many of the same things that you've seen throughout your career. Things like market share expansion, pricing pressures, SG&A expense controls, working capital management, M&A evaluation, investments in productivity-enhancing technology, and more. Before I read Dave Revsine's New York Times bestseller, I naively figured that college football's formative years looked nothing like college football today. Whether you're a college football fan or not, hopefully you'll see how the fundamental drivers of so many parts of our world have remained remarkably similar. Using Dave's 4 years of research to support this premise that you'll hear more about shortly. A valuable history lesson indeed. Dave has had a very, very busy and extremely successful 7+ years as the face of the Big Ten Network. He's been at BTN since its inception in 2007, returning home to Chicago following a very successful decade at ESPN in anchor and play-by-play roles. I've enjoyed getting to know Dave during his years at BTN. This year alone, Dave has covered Ohio State's college football championship, and last week, he was in Indianapolis to see the Wisconsin Badgers and Michigan State Spartans play in the Final Four. Dave went to high school nearby at Glenbrook North. In fact, he grew up in Northbrook, and he graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Northwestern University. In 2009, Sports Illustrated named Dave as one of the top sportscasters of the decade. Dave's agreed to stay for Q&A from the audience following his roughly 25-minute presentation. Please enjoy the book for those of you that got here early enough, and join me in welcoming Dave Revsine.
No, okay, we'll leave it there then. Thank you, Chris. That was really nice of you, and it's really a pleasure to be here. It's funny, there is an irony for me in addressing this group. I think it would be a stretch to say as a kid I would have been voted the least likely person in my family to address a group of financial executives, but I certainly would have been a very, very, very distant second. My father was for many years the chairman of the accounting department at Kellogg at Northwestern. He passed away in 2007. And I did not follow a similar path. I was a history major. And before my senior year, my dad said to me, you know, you need to have at least some working knowledge of how the financial world works. And so he twisted my arm a little bit. As you probably know, there's no undergraduate business at Northwestern, but they did have an intro to accounting course. And so I humored him and I said, all right, I'll take the intro to accounting course. And I started in on it, and about 3 or 4 weeks in, the midterms coming up, and to say I was lost would somehow imply that like I had a sense of where we were going. I just didn't even know what it was about. And so I put my tail between my legs. I went to my dad's office and I sat down, and he kind of helped me through it. I mean, I could just tell he was really stunned at just how incompetent I was in this field. And he told me many years later that he went home to my mom that night and he said, I don't know if there's a gene for accounting, but if there is, it's clearly recessive. So, with that background though, my dad's specialty was financial statement analysis, and you know, when everything went down, like with Enron and that type of stuff, that was really, it was kind of in his wheelhouse. And the games that people play with financial statements, which for me to talk to this group about that is borderline silly. But what I thought was interesting that he would explain to me was, you know, look, you're presented with this statement, but there's a story behind the story. How did we get here? There are footnotes. You got to read the footnotes. How did they arrive at these numbers? What are they trying to hide? And in much the same way, that was kind of how I approached the story of college football. We see the game, we know what it is, but how did it end up this way? I mean, how did we end up with this game attached to our major academic institutions? And we're the only society in the world that did this. How did it evolve in this way? And why do we have some of these constructs that we now take for granted? How did they get there? And I think much like analyzing a financial statement, the best way to get to this, to find out this story, is to start with where we are now and kind of work our way backwards. And so where are we now? We have a game in college football that is immensely popular. The first college football playoff championship, which was held this year, which Chris was talking about, between Ohio State and Oregon, it wasn't just the highest rated football game or the highest rated sporting event ever on cable television. It was the highest rated program ever in the history of cable television. So I think right there, it's pretty clear that it's a popular venture. Extremely profitable. That number's from the Department of Education. 2013 is the most recent number available. $3.5 billion in revenue from college football. It's not at the level of the NFL or Major League Baseball, but it's very similar to the level, for instance, of the NHL and the NBA. So it gives you a sense of just how big an enterprise this is. And then I think anyone who is involved in the sport, and certainly I'm intimately involved in it, but I would be the first to tell you that it's a problematic enterprise, right? There's no doubt about it. I mean, we have academic scandals. You hear about recruiting scandals in the papers, conflicts over finances. This is a huge deal, obviously, with all the money that's being generated, how much of it should go to the student athletes, debates about how we define an amateur. That's been front and center. The Northwestern Union case has grabbed a lot of headlines in the last year or so here locally. Concerns about injuries. Certainly everyone is well aware of the concussion crisis that's going on in football. And so how did we get here? How did we arrive at a popular, profitable, and problematic enterprise? That was what I set out to find out. And in order to kind of get you in the mode a little bit, I want to go back a few years to a quote of someone who was involved in the college football enterprise. Here's what he was, a professor at a prominent university, and here's what he said about the football team. This is a quote. During the season, the men do next to nothing in their studies. For the greater part of time, their mental and physical condition is such that it's difficult for them to make good progress in learning. The game is far from a sport for those who play it. Then he gets into some specifics here. The work of some of them, being the players, was as follows. From 11 till 1, kicking and catching. From 2:30 till 5, football, then dinner. After dinner, talks on football. In other words, football from 11 in the morning till 10 at night. With this amount of work during the day, followed by a night's rest, which was often broken by wakefulness, in spite of the friendly drugs. He had talked earlier about how many of the players were addicted to sleeping medications because of how beaten up they had been from the game. Their mental condition was such that study of any kind was useless. Their pale and haggard faces, dull eyes, and languid manner were constantly commiserated by classmates and professors. So this description, as it turns out, comes from a professor at Harvard in 1893. So for those yearning for a simpler, halcyon time, when college football was the domain of well-mannered Ivy Leaguers, I would tell you to disabuse yourself of that notion. My research showed that really that time that I think that we've somehow convinced ourselves existed never did exist. And my overarching point is this: the scope of college football has inarguably changed. The scope of the enterprise is dramatically bigger than it was in those days. But the underlying issues have remained exactly the same as they were 120 years ago. The time period that I focused my book on is 1890 to 1915, which I argue were the most formative years of the game. People were debating exactly the same things then that they're debating now with the game. There is truly nothing new under the sun. So how did we get to college football? Well, there have been kicking games for centuries. I mean, there are talks in the 1400s in Scotland about people playing kicking games. Football, kind of as we know it, has its origins in the mid-1800s. There were kicking games on college campuses across the United States that were brought over from England. Most of them were based along the premise of kicking a ball between two posts. It was more what we would think of as soccer, or even maybe an offshoot of rugby than football. The first intercollegiate game, as you may know, was played between Princeton and Rutgers in 1869. But again, that wasn't the first football game. People have been playing football between students at the same school. It was just the first time the two schools played one another. And the games were really friendly. I mean, you read these accounts of these games in the 1860s and the early 1870s, and the players would take the train from one campus to the other. The Princeton guys would go to Rutgers and get off the train, they'd play some billiards, they'd walk around town, they'd have lunch together, and then maybe mid-afternoon they'd go out to the field, there'd be a few hundred people there, they'd kick the ball around. The results of the game were kind of an afterthought. Afterwards, they'd have a banquet, they'd toast one another, they'd drink heavily and eat, and then the Princeton guys got back on the train and went home, and that was the end of it. But the tenor of the game changed very, very quickly. And 1876 is the year that I really felt like there was a dramatic shift. There was a new captain elected at Yale, a guy named Eugene V. Baker, and Baker emphasized that it was important to win. This is the Yale team from 1876. The guy holding the football in the middle there is Eugene V. Baker, and over what would be his left shoulder, kind of staring off into the distance, is Walter Camp, who is known as for most people as kind of the father of American football. He's the person who came up with most of the rules, the scoring system, through the years as a part of the Rules Committee. The student newspaper at Yale in 1876 encouraged that all should make a common effort by doing what lies in his power to put in the field the strongest possible team to represent us. So all of a sudden, there's this feeling of, hey, it's not just about competing, it's about winning. Why? Why did winning become important? Well, one thing I would say is I think it's just human nature, right? Anytime you're competing, you're keeping score, people want to win. But there were some other forces at work that I think had a lot more to do with it. One of the biggest things was public relations. This was a time of immense expansion in colleges in the United States. And the model of how you would think colleges were started and how they were really started is completely reversed. I mean, you would think that it was filling a need, right? Like, okay, we've got all these students who need to be educated, let's found a college. It was really the exact opposite. People would found colleges as kind of something to brag about in their community, and then they would go on this desperate search for students to serve. So by the 1870s, there are literally more colleges in the United States than in the whole of Europe. So how do you differentiate yourself as a college? How do you convince people that Lafayette is better than Lehigh? And they quickly found out that football was a way that they could do that. That you could use your football team as a public relations mechanism. And there was perhaps no school that grasped this concept better than our own University of Chicago here in the Windy City. As you may know, the University of Chicago was founded very late in the game. Most of these, obviously the East Coast colleges, many of them date back hundreds and hundreds of years. But even in the college founding frenzy, Chicago, I should say, was founded late in the game. It was founded with Rockefeller money in the 1890s, and the idea was for the school to instantly compete on a plane with Yale and Harvard and Princeton. And one of the ways that they saw that they could do this was with the football team. Now the model in the East Coast was, you didn't have a full-time coach, which you do at Yale, for instance. Yale was the first football factory. They were the powerhouse. And what Yale would do is when students graduated at the end of their course of playing for the football team, they would stay on for a year or two. And the guys who had been the captain the year before would stay and be the coach of the team. And obviously they knew the game well and were educated in what they would call the science of the game. So they were able to pass along their knowledge. The problem in the Midwest was you didn't have that because you didn't have the tradition that the East Coast schools did. And so the University of Chicago's first president, William Rainey Harper, happened upon this idea of, what if we hire someone as a professor, a tenured professor, to coach the football team? And that person was Amos Alonzo Stagg. Stagg had been a very famous football player at Yale, was also a great baseball pitcher, was well known throughout the country as a stupendous athlete, and Harper recruited him and offered him this tenured faculty position overseeing what would essentially be an athletic department. He wrote him a letter saying, I want to develop teams we can send around the country and knock out all the colleges. Within a week of starting classes, 1 week, there weren't even doorknobs on the door yet, the University of Chicago had a football team. They played a local high school team and defeated them. Within 3 weeks, they were on the field against Northwestern. And within 2 years, they embarked on a revolutionary cross-country trip. They got a train emblazoned with the words University of Chicago football team across the side. They went out to the West Coast and played a couple games against Stanford, played some local club teams as well. One student who saw this trip, saw the car, referred to the football team as, quote, a traveling advertising organization of the university, which is exactly what it was. One professor in the very early days of the University of Chicago in the late 1890s said that the U of C had two purposes. The first one was to spread the light of knowledge over the Western world, and the second was to lick Michigan. Now this PR battle was enhanced by the media, and today we look at the intense media scrutiny surrounding college athletics, maybe athletics in general, and we say, you know what, it's too much. It's over the top. Well, again, I would argue that it was always over the top. This is an 1893 game between Yale and Princeton. For those of you who got a copy of the book, this book is, or this picture, this game is the game that I center the first chapter of the book around. The game was covered by basically every newspaper in New York, and there were 55 daily papers at the time in New York City. The New York Sun alone, one newspaper, sent 17 reporters to cover the game between Yale and Princeton, Thanksgiving Day, 1893. They devoted 25% of the next day's paper to the game. The game was attended by 50,000 people, which might not seem like a lot today, but I was actually on Keith Olbermann's show, and he brought up this game, and he said, he's a baseball historian, as you may know, and he said that at that time, in the late 1890s, that was more than twice as many people who had ever been to a baseball game. So it gives you a sense of how huge this was. I mean, if you take a close look at the picture, there are people hanging off buildings. I mean, it's just it's a crazy, crazy scene. Why did the newspapers latch on to football? Well, it's a very similar story, actually, to why the colleges latched on to football. It was about competition. Here are the numbers. I'm sure people here would appreciate the numbers, right? Let's quantify it. In 1870, there were 3,500 daily newspapers in the United States. 20 years later, there were 12,000. So you're talking about an increase of more than threefold. So how do you get readers? One of the ways that they did it was they tried to broaden the scope of what newspapers were about. They weren't just about reporting and disseminating the day's news or political opinions, They tried to make it about things that people, everyday people, could relate to. And sports just happened to be one of those things. And football in particular was kind of uniquely positioned to take advantage of this rise in the newspaper industry for a really simple coincidence of the calendar. As it is today, the biggest newspaper of the week was the Sunday paper. That's where they sold all the ads. And they felt like maybe they'd get more people buying the Sunday paper if it had a little more content. And so, what are we going to put in the paper? Well, the games were played on Saturday. So in a nice accident of the calendar, they just started covering college football. And it's important to understand the power of these newspapers. We're talking about a time, obviously, long before television, but before radio as well, and really a time where long-distance travel for most people was very difficult. So the games being played in Madison, Wisconsin, or West Lafayette, or Champaign, most people couldn't get to the game. And so the newspaper was really their lone entree to the game. It was how they understood the game. The newspaper reporters interpreted the game for them. So the power of those papers can't be overstated. So we've established that like today, in the early days, the game was very popular. And that popularity led to the second prong I talked about, which is the profitability. Now these are the football-related profits at Yale, the revenues between 1885 and 1893. The revenues increased 13-fold. The profits, it was slightly more dramatic. In 1885, that number that you can't really see there's a little bit of a purple line. They made $19.49 off the football team. By 1893, 8 years later, they made more than $23,000 off the football team. The 1894 game between Harvard and Yale, which was one of the biggest games of the year, netted $3 million in 2014 revenues. So you get a sense that very early on, there was an understanding that there was money to be made here. In the Midwest, Chicago was the school that profited most from the sport. Again, it might strike people as odd knowing kind of what ultimately happened with Chicago, which was that they dropped football. But Chicago was the absolute powerhouse of the region. And Chicago was uniquely positioned to take advantage of what was going on in terms of the profitability of the game because they were in far and away the largest market in the Midwest. Due to the sheer numbers of people who had access to the University of Chicago games, they had a chance to make money, a lot of money, off of football. And Stagg basically started bullying the rest of the conference. What he did was he kind of held them hostage financially. And he said, if you're going to play us, you're going to do it on our financial terms. Which basically meant that while the other schools felt like, well, we should just play, we'll play you in Chicago one year, and then you'll come to Madison or West Lafayette or wherever and play us the next year, and we'll split the gate revenues equally. Stagg didn't like that model. He said, no, you're going to need to pay us whatever we pay you when you come to us. And if you can't do that, then we're not going to come play you. And so as a result, in a 3-year span, Chicago played 47 games, 44 of them were at home. And there was a conflict here in the late 1890s. The Big Ten was founded in 1896. By 1898, everyone was fed up with Chicago, and it looked like the conference was going to fall apart just 2 years after it started. Again, over demands to split the gate revenues equally. Here's what Stagg had to say about that. Under the thin guise of a demand for perfect equality, the universities of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois are insisting it's Chicago's duty to do what the creator of all the universe himself does not do. They assume that persons occupying unfavorable business positions ought to receive as much remuneration as persons enjoying the most exceptional opportunities for trade and profit. And if they do not receive as much, it's the duty of those better off to give of their earnings enough to make all share alike. Stagg referred to his model as, quote, a matter of self-preservation, an assertion that journalist Caspar Whitney attacked in Harper's Magazine, which was one of the most popular magazines at the time, as further evidence of the manner in which finances were distorting the world of college football. This is a quote, the self-preservation of what? Of student athletics for the health of the body and the glory of the sport, or of a big successful business? Again, this is 1898. So the desire for the publicity and the profits led to our final prong, which is the problematic part of the game. I picked out a few examples here. Columbia is a great example. Columbia was part of the very early history of the sport. In fact, they played their first game in 1870, 1 year after that first Rutgers-Princeton game. And almost from the beginning, they were absolutely dreadful. Some things never change. It's been a struggle for them for years. And so in the 1890s, they just decided, you know what, to heck with it. We're not going to play football. We're going to focus on the crew team. And they were very competitive in crew throughout the 1890s. And then in 1899, they kind of looked around and said, you know what, this may have been a bit of a miscalculation. Because people aren't really coming to watch the crew team row. But man, Princeton and Yale are making a lot of money off football. So they decided they would take it up again, but the way they were going to do it was they went out and hired a real high-press coach, a guy who had been one of the star players at Yale. And in 1899, the first year back with that team, they beat Yale, which was unheard of. The only schools that had beaten Yale in the 30 years, basically, since the game had started, were Harvard and Princeton. So for Columbia to do it was absolutely shocking. Now, in the off-season, the New York papers kind of started to do a little bit of digging. And it was revealed that Columbia maybe hadn't necessarily been completely above board with this football team. They had been laundering money, and they had been channeling that money illegally to the players who were hired for the sole purpose of playing on the team. They weren't actually students at the school. In a letter to the administration, one alum referred to it as, quote, the most disgraceful scandal ever known in college athletics. The graduate manager, who was the position who would make the schedule and handle all the finances, he turned out to be kind of the fall guy in this. And he was very summarily fired by Columbia's coach. The coach, the guy who had beaten Yale, wiped his hands of the whole affair. He actually got a raise. I mean, after all, he beat Yale. Michigan in 1893, I use them as an example. It's almost unfair. I say 7 of the 11 players weren't enrolled in school, but no one really thought twice about it. I mean, part of the early history of the game was who should be on these teams? Who's to say it needs to be someone that's enrolled in the school, right? This was part of the reason that the athletic conferences were founded. We need to come up with some rules, but Michigan took it to some extremes in that 1893 season. Harvard is a great example. You know, we think of Harvard, obviously, as this august academic institution. Athletically, they had been Yale's punching bag. I mean, Yale just pummeled them year in and year out. And the Harvard alums got fed up with it. And so they basically decided that they were going to go out and get themselves a serious coach. They were going to break the system in the East Coast where you had a recent alum, essentially as a volunteer, former player. And they hired a guy who had played there about 7 or 8 years ago, a guy named Bill Reed, who was living on the West Coast. They made him the highest priced coach at any school in the nation. He made 30% more than the highest paid professor at Harvard. And he made almost as much as the university president, who had been there since just after the Civil War. He'd been there for 35 years. Reed's first job was to find players. Among those he tried to get on the team was a tackle named Preston Upham, who had been expelled from school once already. He was trying to get him readmitted. Here's how he described Upham. Quote, he got into street rows, into automobile scrapes, and bad repute in money matters, into gambling and other forms of trouble. The fellow seemed to lack all idea of responsibility or sense of decency and all interest in things except loud women. Other than that, he was a good guy. Of another potential star, Walter Harrison. Here's what Reed had to say about him. He's impressed me as being very lazy in nature and is lacking in ambition in many ways. However, my last year's fullback leaves this year and we shall need a good man. So I made up my mind to try to get him eligible. Again, this is Harvard. So the scandals continue to grab the headlines, as you know today, and I'm sure you're familiar with a number of them. And they're hand in hand with the other big issue, I think, that is really problematic in the sport today, and that is injuries. And again, this is nothing new. In the early days, the game was extremely violent. And the reason for it was pretty straightforward. You couldn't throw a forward pass. There were 2 ways to move the ball. Either you ran it or you kicked it. And so basically, when you snapped the ball offensively trying to move it, everyone knew that you were going to try to run a play, a running play. And so the way the teams tried to overcome the fact that everyone knew they were going to run it and how limited the game was they aligned in what were called wedge formations. There was no rule about how many people needed to be on the line of scrimmage. You didn't need to have a certain number. And so this is Princeton aligned in a wedge. They have 1 player snapping, and then you can see the 10 players behind that guy. And the play would be, they would snap it, the guy at the very back was going to be the ball carrier, and everyone would kind of move in concert and plow over one opposing player. They all knew where they were headed. So we're going to the left tackle this time. You'd send 10 guys at the left tackle, and then the runner would run through the vacated space. So as you might expect, this led to a lot of problems with injuries, shockingly so, frankly. Then this morphed into a different formation, which was known as the flying wedge. And this took the idea of the wedge. This is that same picture we were looking at before, and it's kind of hard to tell, but on the near portion of the picture, you see all the players that are kind of grouped together there. That is the Princeton team preparing to kick off in this game against Yale. And what they are going to do, there's a guy in the middle there, again, it's kind of hard to tell, who is holding the ball. He's going to snap it back. At the time, right when he snaps it, all of those other guys come running forward from 15 yards behind. So you add the force that you had with the wedge to the concept of momentum, and as you can expect, it got pretty ugly. In 1894, there was a match between Harvard and Yale, which essentially deteriorated into a boxing match. Harvard president Charles Eliot, the guy who was making almost less than the football coach, declared the sport to be, quote, unfit for college use. He got resistance from a fairly prominent Harvard grad, a fellow by the name of Theodore Roosevelt, who at the time was working in the Civil Service Commission. Roosevelt declared it was, quote, mere unmanly folly to try to do away with the sport because risk exists. Roosevelt's friend, very prominent senator, Henry Cabot Lodge, proclaimed, the time given to athletic contests and the injuries incurred on the playing field are part of the price which the English-speaking race has paid for being world conquerors. So you have a little bit of a battle developing there. The press that we had talked about earlier participated in kind of fanning the flames of this injury controversy that surrounded football. This was the height of yellow journalism, and I talk a lot about it in the book, but for those who aren't familiar with the concept or maybe just need a quick refresher course, yellow journalism was essentially a manner in which the newspapers tried to write stories which would appeal to the broadest swath of the population, regardless of whether there was any veracity involved in the story. So basically, they were just trying to sell papers. It was, fantastic headlines that would grab your attention, that even a person who, wasn't the most literate guy would find to be interesting and would cause them to go out and buy the newspaper. Football was perfect fodder for the yellow journalists, and they absolutely latched onto it. This is Joseph Pulitzer's paper, The New York World, 1897. Again, it's kind of hard to make it out, but the figure snapping the ball is a skeleton. There's a little sash across him that says death, and the caption underneath the cartoon says the 12th player in every football game. And then there are dead players strewn behind him on the field. And while it may have made for some fodder for the cartoons, the truth of the matter was that death really was part of the story in the early years of college football. I have a chart here. 1905 was kind of a crisis year in college football. It's when a lot of things came to a head. In that year, there were 3 deaths in the game. There were 19 at all levels of college football. There were 3 deaths in the college game, but the college deaths were at very prominent schools, and so this kind of got everyone, kind of got the antenna up, where it wasn't just kind of schools off that people weren't paying as much attention to. These were schools like NYU, Union College, and Army. In 1905, the president actually called, Roosevelt at this point has assumed his role in the White House, and he called the leaders of the sport for a summit. And his role has been somewhat overstated, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book. Some give him credit for saving the game, which he didn't really do. But he certainly said to them, look, these numbers, these deaths are unacceptable. As it turns out, it got worse. As you can see, before it got better. In 1909, there were 10 players who died on the field or soon thereafter from injuries occurred in a college football game. What this caused was a significant change in the rules. The most obvious was the introduction of the forward pass. That happened initially in 1905 with some severe restrictions But by 1912, the forward pass was completely integrated into the game. And were you to go to a 1912 football game, it would look very similar to the game we see today. And as you can see, by that 1912 year, the number of deaths in the game had actually declined to 0. So, where are we? We look at college football between 1890 and 1915. You see an emphasis on public relations. You see massive press coverage. You see debates over finances, academic scandals, allegations of player payments, challenges of amateurism, and concerns over injuries. Does any of this sound remotely familiar? It's a game that was popular, it's a game that was profitable, it's a game that was problematic, much like the game we have today. So, as college football works its way through the challenges that it's working through, I think it would be a mistake to say, why can't they just go back to the way things used to be? Because as I think we've all observed, we already have. So that's going to do it for kind of the formal presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions about whether it's the book process or anything else going on in the world of college sports today.
So you mentioned that rowing was surpassed by football, but you know the recent book, The Boys in the Boat,
Yeah.
which claims that in the 20s at least, rowing was still outdrawing football.
Well, there may have been some regattas that did, but...
And it was Yale, and it was...
Right, yeah. I mean, I know there were a couple of big regattas, but so maybe the combined number of people, but I mean, football far and away was grabbing the headlines. I heard Boys in the Boat is fabulous, by the way. I haven't read it yet, but I heard it's just tremendous. Rowing was still a big deal. There's no doubt about it, but football was very clearly, really starting in the 1890s, it was clear that's where the money really was for the broad swath of schools. That's not to say that Yale and Harvard for a big regatta couldn't have gotten huge numbers. Yeah.
I read recently that Harvard and Dartmouth wanted to abolish football entirely because of the deaths. Is that true?
Yeah, so Harvard actually briefly did abolish it, and I get into it a little bit in the book. After that 1894 game against Yale, that was just, I mean, you know, absolutely, you know, I mean, literally bloodshed. They thought a guy had died. It was really bad. Charles Eliot, who was the president of Harvard, really was a conscientious objector to football. And he was a guy who kind of put his money where his mouth was. And there was a lot of internal tension at Harvard. And Harvard really I mean, ultimately it was Harvard that got the game reformed, because Harvard was, even though Yale was better at football, Harvard was still the most powerful school in the country. And in essence, they pulled a power play on Yale and on Walter Camp and the Rules Committee in the early 1900s and said, it's our way or the highway. And if we abolish football, other schools will follow because of how powerful we are. So I get into it quite a bit in the book. It was really like a season where Yale kind of took a seat on the sidelines, but there were some other schools. Columbia did abolish it after they brought back the team. They abolished it during the crisis in 1905, and Northwestern actually did for 2 years too, 1906 and 1907, and brought it back in 1908. So there were a lot of schools that were wrestling with the game. 1905 was, I would argue that other than I'm not sure we're in a crisis right now, but I think we're in a very challenging time. And I would argue that other than this time, 1905 was the biggest crisis the game has ever faced. Yeah?
What was the equivalent back in the early 1900s to today's NCAA?
Well, the NCAA came out of this injury crisis. So the NCAA was basically formed as a governing body to try to alleviate the problems with the injuries. And then it kind of took on this governance role. But 1905 was the founding of the NCAA, and it coincided with all these meetings trying to figure out a way to alter the rules.
What do you make of the current state of the NCAA?
I think it's a really challenging time for them. I mean, look, the basketball tournament is incredibly profitable, and that funds a lot of sports, and that's what that's the biggest thing that the NCAA has. But the governance and the monitoring, I think we're seeing that it's a haphazard system, and I think they are acutely aware that they're going to need to make changes, and I do think we're starting to see some of that, but there's no doubt, and this is, you'd be foolish if you didn't say, and the NCAA themselves says, this is the most troubling time that they've ever had. Yeah.
What do you think of Northwestern kind of leading the charge on unionizing?
I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it's been an interesting case. I think there's an irony maybe that it's Northwestern, but I think maybe, again, it's the type of kids that they attract. I mean, obviously, King Coulter is a smart and thoughtful guy. I don't think unionization is the way for them to go. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think you can see, even in some of the changes in NCAA legislation that have been made in the last couple of years, it's apparent the impact that had. I mean, for instance, the stipend that we're seeing, the full cost of attendance, all of that stuff came out of some of these ideas that these guys put forward. So whether or not they end up unionizing, I still think that the undercurrent had a really positive effect. Yeah, in the back.
Do you think we're done with the conference swapping and the expansion of all these conferences just for the dollar?
Well, I think it's done for the time being, but I think you always look to see whether there's shifting going on or not. So I would never say never. I mean, we started the Big Ten Network 7 years ago, and we didn't have Nebraska, we didn't have Rutgers, and we didn't have Maryland. So there have been a lot of seismic changes in the conference structure just in the 7 years we've been on the air.
Do you think it's helped or hurt overall?
Helped or hurt the Big Ten, or the whole college football landscape?
The whole of college athletics in general.
It's hard to say. I mean, I guess I'm more aware of kind of the impact that it's had on the Big Ten. I don't think it made a whole lot of sense, for instance, when Boise State was saying they were going to play football in the Big East, which they then dropped. I mean, there was a period of about a year where that's where they were headed. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think it makes sense to have student athletes trucking all over the country to run a cross-country meet when there's a school 50 miles away they could run it against. But I also, I understand the forces that are at play. So, I think there's two sides to the coin, I guess, but I think it has to be within some semblance of reason. I think there has to be some geographic proximity and some sort of commonality between the universities. Yeah.
In your opinion, where do you see the greatest and maybe the quickest potential impact or change of the history of the game and as it sits today to improve the experience of the athlete, the institution, the fan base?
Well, the biggest thing that I would say is, inordinately, in talking to people, and I spend a lot of time around people who have played college football or are currently playing college football and college basketball for that matter, I think it's an incredibly positive experience for an inordinate proportion of the people. And I do think that there is this tendency to emphasize and legislate for the exception rather than the rule. And I think this is a great deal for almost every kid that I talk to. So as to where it's going, I mean, look, I do think that there are some changes that are already happening that I think are going to be really positive changes. But particularly if you're a scholarship athlete, I mean, I'm sure a lot of us are either saving for college or have put kids through college. I mean, I think we understand the financial burden that presents. And so to get that in exchange for playing athletics, I think for most kids is a really good deal. But again, it's the kids, there are kids who are the exception who can generate a lot of money for the university. And I think those are the kids that are troubling a lot of people. And I think that's going to continue to be a lot of the story going forward. Yeah.
Where do you think the issue of concussions is going to go?
I mean, I think that's fascinating. I think it's the most troubling thing that's going on right now in football. I think the technology and the safety, it sounds like is getting much better, but the kids are getting bigger. I mean, these are big kids. It's crazy to read about who was considered big in the 1890s and who's considered big now. There's this guy, Pudge Heffelfinger, who played for Yale. Okay, this guy was awe-inspiring. I mean, they wrote about him like you just wouldn't believe the size of this guy. He was 6'3", 200. He's a safety today. Like it's crazy. So these guys are just so big. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's the part of the sport that I really worry about. I mean, all the other stuff we were talking about, what's going to happen with the finances of the game, and I understand kind of some of the concerns, and I see where people are talking about kind of on at the extremes. But when I think about the bulk of kids playing, that's what you worry about. And I don't know. I mean, I will say that in going to football practices, and I spend a lot of time at them, there's a lot less hitting than there used to be. I mean, I think that kind of people are understanding the impact that can have, and trying to get guys ready for games without necessarily having the amount of tackling that there was even 5 or 6 years ago. It's dramatic. Yeah.
So we have an incredibly popular basketball playoff with March Madness, and now we finally got a little bit of a semblance with football, and thankful we were missed this year. We didn't have that 4-team playoff. Certainly how different we've been in Ohio State. You mentioned the most popular cable show ever. Maybe talk, your thoughts on the expansion of the playoffs, and how the bowl games got started, and did we?
I would hate to see it
sell out for the money of bowl games as opposed to putting a championship, where ironically they have a good playoff system. They might even end up making more money.
Well, understand the NCAA doesn't govern the bowls, right? The individual schools, and then there are committees that oversee each individual bowl. The NCAA oversees the basketball tournament. It doesn't oversee the football championship. I don't want to see it any bigger. I mean, to me, I like the bowls. Maybe it's my bias of growing up in the Midwest, but I know a lot of Iowa fans and a lot of Wisconsin fans, a lot of Nebraska fans who really look forward to, they save their money and for that part of the year to go and spend a week somewhere and to be a part of the warmer weather that we get in this part of the country. I think it's great. I love the pageantry of bowls, and I would hate to see us eliminate them or push them so far. A 16-team playoff would basically render the bowls, I think, borderline irrelevant, and I think that would be a shame. So I think this worked pretty well. We're always looking for more. I thought 4 teams was fine, but I understand that there are a lot of people who would love to see it at 8 and 16. I just don't happen to be one of them. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for having me.